On nights when the forest lay hushed beneath a quilt of snow, breath hung in the air like mist and the trees seemed to whisper secrets only the stars could hear. Imagine stepping softly into that world, where warmth was not taken for granted, but carefully woven from nature itself. Welcome, dear listener, to tonight's quiet journey through history. Together we'll drift into the snowy forests of long ago, where Native American tribes learned to endure winter nights without fire. How did they keep warm against the biting cold? What clever methods passed down through generations turned freezing landscapes into survivable homes? Some of these techniques may surprise you, hidden wisdom wrapped in leaves, moss, and the rhythms of nature. So settle in, let the chill of the past meet the comfort of your present, and allow your imagination to wander as we explore. If you find this journey soothing, you're always welcome to leave a like, subscribe for more bedtime history, or share a thought in the comments. And before we begin, I'd love to know, where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? Imagine yourself walking slowly through a snowy forest at night, the world hushed by the weight of winter. Each tree stands heavy with white, and every step presses softly into the frozen ground. The air is sharp, almost metallic, and your breath rises like pale smoke against the dark sky. In this stillness there is no fire to break the cold. Instead, survival depends on knowledge, old, steady knowledge, passed quietly from one generation to the next. In such winters, native families would gather fallen branches scattered across the forest floor. At first glance they looked ordinary, broken limbs, brittle twigs, but in practiced hands they became the bones of a shelter. Stronger branches formed the frame, bowed into arches or leaned together like clasped hands. Lighter twigs filled the gaps, layered again and again until the lattice thickened into walls. What seemed fragile became resilient when bound together with patience. There was a rhythm to the work, the sound of branches creaking as they bent, the gentle snap of twigs trimmed into place, the muffled crunch of snow beneath feet. It was almost like music, played softly for the forest itself. Those who built did so without haste, as if rushing would offend the woods that gave them shelter. Each piece of wood was chosen with care, pine for strength, willow for its pliant curve, birch for its lightness. Nothing was wasted. Step inside such a hut and the world changes. The bitter wind, which moments before cut across your skin, falls silent outside. The walls, woven tightly, trap still air, and still air means warmth. It is not the blazing warmth of fire, but a subtler kind, the quiet insulation of nature itself. The hut breathes with the forest. It smells of bark, damp earth, and crushed leaves, a reminder that safety is never apart from the land but always a part of it. Within, families would huddle close. The ground, once a sheet of ice, was softened with layers of grass and leaves, their textures forming a cushion against the frozen earth. Children curled into the centre, their small bodies pressed between parents, absorbing the comfort of proximity. Elders lay close by, steady in breath, their presence as grounding as the trees outside. Together their bodies formed a circle of life within the fragile hut, each heartbeat another note in the silent music of survival. Outside, the forest continued its vigil. Snow pressed against the walls, sealing small cracks, strengthening the hut rather than breaking it. Wolves might call in the distance, their voices echoing against the cold night. But inside there was only stillness, broken sometimes by whispers. These whispers were not of fear, but of story. Old tales told softly, so words would slip like dreams into the minds of those drifting towards sleep. In the absence of fire, memory itself became a kind of warmth. Yet these huts were never permanent. They were built to endure nights, perhaps a handful of days, before being left behind, and in that impermanence lay their wisdom. Life did not need permanence to survive, only resilience. Branches, twigs, snow, and patience. Each part small, each part fragile, but woven together, they created shelter, strong enough to outlast the cruelest cold. To imagine lying there in a hut of branches is to understand a truth older than time, that survival is not always loud or mighty. Sometimes it is quiet, made of fragile things that endure because they are joined, not because they are unbreakable. And as snow falls heavier outside, the little hut holds a soft cradle of wood and silence, teaching that even in the harshest winter, the forest itself will guide those who listen closely. The forest, even in its coldest hours, always offered something to those who knew how to look. After shaping the bones of a hut from branches and twigs, the native builders turned to what would become its skin. The broad, tough bark peeled carefully from fallen trunks, and the large leaves gathered when the season allowed. Together, these simple elements transformed a fragile frame into a shelter that could breathe, endure, and protect. The process began with patience and reverence. Bark was never stripped carelessly from living trees, for to wound a tree without need was to disturb the balance of the woods. Instead, people sought the trunks that had already fallen, their surfaces cracked with time, their outer layers waiting to be used once more. The pieces were thick, almost leathery in their strength, bending only slightly before holding their form. When laid over the woven branches, they became shingles against the sky, each piece overlapping the next so that rain or snow would slide away rather than seep through. Leaves, too, played their part. In spring and summer, when forests grew dense and green, large leaves were gathered and pressed into the gaps, soft yet firm, their broad shapes acting like tiles of nature. Some were layered thickly, bound together by smaller twigs, creating mats that could be laid across the roof. In winter, when fresh leaves were gone, dried bundles collected earlier were brought out, reminding everyone how survival meant planning far beyond the moment. To touch them was to feel the seasons held in your hands, the memory of warmer days stitched into the fabric of a cold night. Inside, the difference was immediate. Where before the cold wind slipped through the branches, now it was slowed, hushed, turned into a faint whisper rather than a cutting blade. The bark held firm against the weight of snow, and the leaves softened the sound of storm so that those resting beneath could drift into sleep with only the faint patter of flakes above. The scent of the hut changed too, earthy and damp when bark was fresh, sweet and dry when leaves lined the roof, each fragrance weaving itself into memory. At night, the roofing seemed almost alive. Bark cracked faintly as temperatures shifted, leaves rustled with the smallest breath of air, and snow slid gently across the sloping cover. Children listened to these sounds as they lay close to their parents, their eyes heavy with sleep, the noises above becoming part of their dreams. The hut was not perfect. Drips would sometimes fall, wind would find a narrow passage, but in the great silence of the forest, it was enough. It was a gift, a reminder that even without fire, warmth could be borrowed from the earth itself. These roofs were never meant to last forever. Storms could tear them down, heavy snow could press them flat, and time would always return bark and leaf to soil. Yet the people who built them understood this truth. Survival was not about permanence, but about resilience. Each new night might demand another roof, another layering of bark and leaves, another conversation with the forest. And in this endless cycle, a quiet wisdom lived, one that told them that nature never truly abandoned its children, so long as they listened closely, so long as they worked with gentle hands. To lie beneath such a roof was to feel the weight of the forest watching over you. The rough bark shielded, the leaves softened, and together they formed a cradle where sleep could come even in the deepest cold. And when morning broke, shafts of pale light slipped between the seams, carrying with them the promise of another day survived, another night remembered in the long story of life in the snowy woods. In the stillness of a winter forest, where the air itself seemed to bite the skin and every shadow was rimmed with frost, there was a lesson that native peoples understood well. Sometimes, the very thing that threatened life could also be turned into its shield. Snow, deep and heavy, was not only an enemy that chilled the body and silenced the earth, but also a companion, ready to serve as a barrier if one knew how to shape it. And so, on nights when the wind howled low through the trees, when branches groaned beneath their frozen weight, families began their quiet work of building walls from snow, walls that would stand against the storm like silent guardians. The process was gentle, almost ritual-like. Hands wrapped in hide gloves or bare when strength was needed, pressed and packed the snow, not loosely but firmly, until it hardened into blocks. These were not cut in neat lines like the ice houses of far northern lands, but instead formed in rough slabs lifted and stacked to make a wall. Where the snow was deep, trenches were carved, and the walls rose naturally from what was left behind. Children sometimes joined, their laughter muffled by the night as they carried handfuls of snow to fill the cracks, turning play into survival. The sound was soft, the crunch of boots, the hollow thud of snow packed into place, the low hum of breath steaming in the cold. When the wool was finished, it did not shine or boast of its strength. From afar it looked like nothing more than a drift shaped by the wind, another curve in the endless whiteness. Yet to those who lay behind it, the difference was profound. The wind no longer cut so sharply. Its howl softened to a muted sigh as it struck the barrier and slipped away. The cold did not vanish, but it lost its teeth, its piercing edge dulled by the wall of snow that stood like a buffer between human breath and the vast winter beyond. Inside these makeshift shelters, life slowed. People sat closer together, their shoulders brushing, their cloaks pulled tight, the snow wall at their backs a strange kind of comfort. There was no fire, no dancing flame to chase away shadows, yet the stillness itself became warmth, a quiet reassurance that nature had given them the tools to survive. The snow, which so easily buried paths and swallowed villages, now offered protection, holding back the same wind that might have stolen the last of their strength. The walls also became part of the night's music. Snow shifted and settled with a faint sigh, sometimes collapsing slightly, sometimes hardening further under the weight of the sky. These small sounds lulled the weary, weaving into dreams of rivers flowing beneath ice, or of white fields stretching endlessly under the moon. For children especially, the snow walls felt like magical forts, places where the storm could roar outside yet never quite reach them, where sleep came softly despite the cold. There was a deeper wisdom in this practice too. It reminded everyone that survival did not mean fighting against nature, but bending with it, finding its hidden kindness even in moments of harshness. The snow that seemed so merciless could also be shaped into protection. The storm that threatened could be turned aside with nothing more than patience and strong hands. Each wall was temporary, meant only for a night or two, soon to melt or collapse or vanish in drifting winds, but in that brief time, it carried the weight of life itself. To rest behind such walls was to feel a strange intimacy with winter. The barrier was cold to the touch, damp sometimes against the skin, yet it held back the wild heart of the storm. Breathing slowed, eyes closed, and sleep came, fragile but real. And when dawn broke, painting the snow in hues of pale blue and silver, the walls still stood in quiet dignity, proof that even the coldest of elements could become a guardian when shaped by human will. The forest in winter could be merciless, its air sharp enough to sting the lungs and its nights stretching endlessly under the pale glow of the moon. Yet even in this frozen world, native people discovered warmth in the gifts of the animals that lived alongside them. Deer and wolf, creatures of the wild, carried within their skins the perfect answer to the cold. Thick hides layered with fur that defied the bite of snow and wind. To wear or sleep beneath these hides was to borrow the strength of those animals, to let their natural armour shield the human body against the long night. Deer hides were often the first and most common protection. Soft, pliable, and plentiful, they were prepared with great care, scraped clean of flesh, stretched and smoked until they were supple enough to bend without cracking. The fur side, warm and gentle, was worn inward to press against the skin, trapping precious body heat where it mattered most. In colder regions, deer hides were layered. 1, 2, sometimes 3, until a person was wrapped in a cocoon of earthy warmth. The smell of cured leather clung to them, a faint reminder of both the hunt and the forest that had provided. Wolf hides, by contrast, carried a different weight. Wolves were fewer, harder to hunt, and often taken with deep respect. Their coats were dense, thick with underfur designed to withstand the cruelest winds of the northern plains and snowy woodlands. To wrap a wolf hide around the shoulders was to feel an almost immediate difference, as though the cold itself paused before trying to reach the skin. At night, these hides became blankets, heavy yet protective, their coarse outer hairs brushing against hands, their underlayers holding warmth close to the body. Sleeping beneath one was to feel a primal connection, a sense that the wild itself was guarding the sleeper. The hides were not used alone. Families understood that survival depended on layers, on the clever stacking of materials that nature provided. A bed of grass or moss insulated from below, and deer or wolf hides completed the barrier above, sealing in the heat of gathered bodies. Children were often nestled in the centre, swaddled tightly in hides so that their small breaths filled the air with gentle steam, while adults circled around them, their own hides drawn close. In such closeness, the hides became more than coverings. They became symbols of family, of protection passed from animal to human, from parent to child. To wear these hides was also to carry stories. Each deer taken in the hunt was not just food, but warmth. Its skin carried forward as cloaks, leggings and blankets that kept a tribe alive through the bleakest seasons. Each wolf, fierce and elusive, left behind a memory of respect, its hide preserved with ritual and care. In the quiet of a winter night, when the hut or snow wall pressed close, people could run their hands across the fur, feeling both the softness and the wild power it represented. The hides brought sound as well as touch. When shifted in the dark, they rustled softly, leather against fur, a faint creak as layers rubbed together. This subtle music became part of the night's rhythm, blending with the distant howl of living wolves, the crack of snow-laden branches, and the slow breathing of those huddled in sleep. Wrapped in deer and wolf hides, the boundary between human and animal blurred, survival woven into the same fabric that clothed both hunter and hunted. To sleep beneath such coverings was not just survival, it was communion. The warmth that allowed rest came not from fire, but from the living memory of creatures that had walked the forest paths before. The hides reminded every sleeper that life in the snowy woods was never lived alone, but always in connection with the trees, with the snow, and with the animals whose strength could be borrowed in the coldest hours. And when dawn returned, touching the fur with silver light, the people rose knowing they carried the forest's endurance upon their very skin. When the forest grew silent under heavy snow, and the night stretched so long that even the stars seemed frozen in their places, the people of the land learned to make warmth not with firelight, but with their hands. From the hides of deer, elk, and wolf, they shaped coverings that could cradle a family through the bitter dark. A single hide might soften the edge of cold, but when sewn, folded, and layered, it became something greater. A blanket that wrapped the body in the wild's own protection, or a garment that turned skin into armour against the winter winds. The work of transformation began after the hunt, in the quiet patience of camp life. Hides were scraped clean, stretched across wooden frames, and treated with smoke and fat until they grew supple and strong. The women of the tribe, skilled in the slow rhythm of needles made from bone and thread spun from sinew, stitched them together. A single deer hide might serve as a cloak, its fur turned inward to catch warmth. But 3 hides joined became a thick blanket, wide enough to cover children huddled together on a bed of pine needles. Each stitch carried not only skill but care, the thread binding more than hide. It bound memory, survival, and the promise of another day. Layering was the secret to endurance, just as the forest itself wore layers, snow upon branch, bark upon wood, moss upon stone. So too did the people wrap themselves in tier upon tier of hide and fur. The first layer lay close to the skin, soft and insulating. Above it, another was added, heavy and coarse, to block the wind, and sometimes a third, thick with winter fur, sealed in the heat like the roof of a shelter. Clothing became more than protection. It was a living shield, shaped from the bodies of animals who had known the same cold, who had survived by growing coats that humans could now share. Blankets, too, held their own kind of power. At night, when the snow walls whispered and the huts creaked under frost, families drew the hides over themselves, pulling them close until only their faces showed in the pale half-light. The hide smelled of earth and smoke, of forest and fire, each scent mingling with the breath of those who slept beneath them. Children pressed their faces into the fur, comforted by its softness, while elders lay quietly, their thoughts drifting to hunts long past, when such hides had first been won. The sound of shifting blankets filled the dark. Leather creaked, fur rustled, and the layered clothing whispered against itself with every movement. In this gentle symphony there was no harshness, only the steady rhythm of survival. The blankets became like a second home, a shelter carried wherever the people went, while the clothing turned each person into their own hut, wrapped in warmth even when they stepped outside into the frozen forest. There was a symbolism in these coverings as well. Blankets were not only tools of warmth but gifts of care. A parent giving their child an extra hide, an elder offering a fur cloak to the young. Each act carried meaning, each layer a silent promise of protection. To wear layered clothing, or to sleep beneath thick hides, was to feel not only the warmth of animals, but also the warmth of family and tribe, woven into every seam and fold. In the snowy stillness, these hides became the difference between shivering restlessness and deep, steady sleep. Wrapped in them, the body relaxed, breathing slowed, and the vastness of winter faded into the background. And when dawn came, casting silver light across the forest floor, the layered blankets and clothing glowed softly with frost, proof that they had held back the night once again. For those who slept within their folds, it was not just rest they found. It was a reminder that even in the harshest cold, the world had given them everything they needed to endure. The night in the snowy forest could press down with a heaviness that seemed endless, its chill seeping into every crevice, its silence broken only by the creak of ice-laden branches and the faint rustle of wind weaving between the trees. For those who lay down to rest, even thick hides and layered clothing were sometimes not enough to hold back the steady, biting cold. And so the people, ever watchful, ever resourceful, turned to another gift of the land, the softness of grass, and where herds allowed, the warmth of wool. When stuffed into hides, these humble materials transformed a simple covering into a cocoon, a barrier that could cradle the body in a deeper heat. The work began long before the heart of winter. In warmer months, while the sun lingered high and the meadows swayed with tall grasses, careful hands gathered bundles of dry stalks. They were not left in the open to dampen, but stored with care, bound and tucked away for the days when the snow would bury every green thing from sight. Wool, when it was available, came with even greater reverence. It was pulled gently from the coats of animals or gathered after shedding, soft, light, and precious. Together, grass and wool became a hidden treasure, waiting quietly until the bitter season called upon their use. When the cold grew sharpest, the hides were prepared for this layering. The fur was left intact, but pockets were sewn or folds created where grass could be packed tightly. The dried stalks, though brittle in hand, softened once pressed together, forming a springy cushion that trapped air and held warmth close. Wool was even better, fine, delicate fibres that interlocked to create a nest of insulation, warm without weight. As these were stuffed into cloaks, leggings, or blankets, the difference was immediate. The hides grew thicker, heavier, but they held heat more faithfully, like the walls of a well-built hut. To wear such clothing or sleep beneath such blankets was to feel as though the earth itself had wrapped around you. The grass whispered faintly with movement, a soft crackle beneath the fur like the sound of autumn remembered in the depth of winter. Wool gave a gentler touch, a quiet comfort against the skin, almost like a lullaby made tangible. Children often nestled more deeply in hides stuffed with grass, giggling at the rustling sound before sleep claimed them, while elders found comfort in the steady, enveloping warmth that eased their tired bones. The nights spent in these coverings carried their own kind of music. The shifting of bodies made the grass sigh and murmur, a reminder that the fields and meadows still lived in memory, even beneath layers of snow. The smell of dried grass clung faintly to the air, earthy and sweet, mingling with the musk of hides and the sharp bite of frost beyond the shelter. For a sleeper, these scents and sounds worked together, painting dreams of summer days, of wide skies and flowing rivers, offering a warmth not only to the body but to the spirit. Stuffed hides were also practical in another way. They could be renewed, filled again when the grass flattened or the wool shifted. In this constant tending, there was a rhythm of care, a reminder that survival was never a single act, but a continuous weaving of effort, a partnership between people and nature. The hides themselves became like living companions, shaped and reshaped with each season, carrying with them the patience of countless hands. To rest within such warmth was to experience the forest differently. Beyond the walls of snow, the storm might rage, wind tearing through the branches, snow piling higher with every hour. Yet inside the layered stuffed hides, the world softened. Breathing slowed, shivers faded, and the long night became bearable. And when dawn returned, pale and cold, those who rose from their grass and wool-stuffed coverings knew that they had carried a fragment of summer into the heart of winter, keeping life alive through the smallest of nature's gifts. When the snow fell thick upon the forest floor and the wind circled endlessly through the trees, survival became not only a matter of what nature gave, but also of how people held on to one another. No fire burned in these nights, no flames rose to chase away the darkness, yet there was a deeper warmth to be found, a warmth drawn from the nearness of human bodies. To lie close together was more than comfort. It was a quiet pact of survival, a shared rhythm of breath and heartbeat that softened the edge of winter's chill. The scene was simple, but it carried profound weight. Inside a hut of branches, or behind the shelter of snow walls, the tribe gathered in a circle or a line, pressing side by side until shoulders touched and legs overlapped. Children were tucked carefully between parents, their small forms nestled in hides so that the heat of many could protect the few. Elders, frailer but rich with memory, were given central places where the warmth pooled thickest. Each person gave what they could, an arm draped across another's shoulder, a back pressed to another's chest, a steadying presence through the long night. The warmth that passed between them was not sudden like fire, but slow and enduring. Layered hides and stuffed blankets trapped the heat, and the nearness of bodies turned that space into a cradle. Breath rose softly into the air, forming faint clouds that drifted together, mingling before fading. The sound of sleep became its own kind of music. The low sigh of an elder, the shifting of children against their blankets, the rustle of fur as someone turned in their rest. These sounds, so ordinary, carried reassurance. They reminded every sleeper that they were not alone, that even in the deepest night the tribe was present, woven together in silence. There was a kind of rhythm in this closeness. As one person shifted, another leaned, and the weight balanced out. As warmth faded on the edge of the circle, someone pulled the hides tighter, drawing the heat back in. The group moved almost like a single body, adjusting unconsciously, each part caring for the whole. This living connection went beyond survival. It was a reminder of belonging, of ties stronger than the cold, stronger even than hunger. For the children, this closeness left an imprint. They drifted to sleep with a steady drum of heartbeats all around them, the warmth of their parents' bodies sealing them into dreams. For the elders, the embrace of the group recalled older nights, when they themselves had been shielded in the same way, carried forward by the generations before. And for the hunters and mothers who lay wakeful in the dark, the nearness of their people gave strength, a quiet assurance that no storm, however fierce, could sever what was bound by touch. The forest outside roared in its own way. Branches cracked beneath the weight of snow, wolves howled across frozen distances, the wind scraped its voice along the bark of trees, but inside the cluster of bodies, the world softened. Time seemed to pause, narrowed to the warmth of skin against skin, to the shared breath that filled the shelter with faint mist. There was no need for words. The silence itself was heavy with meaning, a reminder that to endure the cold was not the task of one, but of all together. To awaken in the pale light of dawn, still pressed close to kin, was to feel the success of that bond. The snow had not conquered them, the night had not broken them. They had leaned upon one another, and in doing so they had carried the warmth of life into another day. This nearness, this gathering of bodies in the cold, was more than a method. It was a lesson that in the heart of winter human closeness itself could become a fire, glowing without flame, lasting without ash. In the snowy forests where the night pressed down like a heavy cloak and the air cut sharp against the skin, survival was never left to chance. Every action carried meaning, every habit was shaped by memory passed from one generation to the next. Among the quiet strategies of the people, one practice stood out with tender wisdom. The children and women were always placed in the centre of the sleeping group. It was a choice born of necessity, yet it carried with it a deep sense of care, an instinctive layering of protection where the most vulnerable were wrapped in the warmth of the tribe itself. The outer edges of the group were coldest, touched first by the creeping air that slipped through hides and snow walls. To lie on the outside meant to bear the bite of winter more fully, to guard the warmth that built up within. Hunters, young men, and those with stronger bodies often took these places, letting their resilience stand against the frost. But at the heart, shielded on every side, were the children, their small bodies more easily shaken by cold, and the women, whose health was tied to the tribe's very survival. To protect them was to protect tomorrow itself. The scene inside the shelter was always gentle, almost ceremonial in its order. A mother would settle her child against her chest, wrapping a hide around them both. Another woman might curl close beside her, their warmth blending, their breaths mingling in small clouds that rose and vanished. Around them, fathers and brothers stretched out, their backs and shoulders forming a living barrier. On the farthest edges, the hunters lay with cloaks pulled tight, keeping watch even in their sleep, knowing their bodies were the shield against the cold's advance. This arrangement created more than just warmth. It created a rhythm of trust. A child, half asleep, might reach out in the dark and feel not just their mother, but the steady presence of others pressing near. Women, though still burdened by the weight of survival, could rest more deeply knowing that the tribe had encircled them, that their safety was held within a quiet fortress of bodies. Even the men who bore the cold at the edges did so with a kind of pride, aware that their endurance was the wall that made this safety possible. The sounds of the night in such a circle carried a strange comfort. The faint breaths of children mixed with the low sighs of their mothers, the shifting of hides, the muffled crack of snow settling outside. These were not just noises, but reassurances, soft signals that life pulsed strongly at the centre. Even as the storm raged in the forest, inside the shelter there was a heartbeat, steady and collective, like the sound of the earth itself continuing on. For the elders, who had seen many winters, this practice carried memory. They remembered nights of their youth when they too had been placed at the centre, guarded and shielded by those older and stronger. Now, watching their grandchildren sleep in that same warmth, they felt the cycle continue, each generation wrapping the next in its protection, as had always been done. It was a chain of survival, woven not with weapons or fire, but with the simple act of care. At dawn, when the snow outside glowed faintly blue and the forest stirred with cautious light, the circle would loosen. The hunters would rise stiffly from the cold edges, shaking frost from their hides, while the women and children, still warmed from the centre, stretched gently awake. The pattern would repeat again the next night, a quiet ritual as constant as breath. For in keeping children and women in the centre, the people ensured not only warmth, but also continuity, a reminder that the heart of the tribe was always protected, always nurtured, always at the centre of life itself. When the snowy forest lay in silence, its branches heavy with frost and the night stretching endlessly across the land, warmth was not a gift easily found. No flames crackled, no firelight glowed against the trees, and yet the people endured. They did so by turning to the simplest, most constant source of heat, each other. Body pressed to body, breath mingling with breath, they created a living fire, one without sparks or smoke, but strong enough to guard against the long and merciless cold. The act itself was quiet, almost unremarkable to those who lived it daily, but within it rested a deep wisdom. Human warmth, though small when felt alone, became powerful when gathered. A single hand held against another's skin offered little, but dozens of bodies gathered in closeness created a steady, lasting shield against winter. Wrapped in hides and thick blankets, the heat built slowly, like water filling a vessel, until the cold could no longer pierce its way through. It was not sudden comfort, but a patient one, growing breath by breath, heartbeat by heartbeat. Within the shelter, this closeness felt like a slow tide. Those on the edges absorbed the bite of cold, while those deeper inside sank into warmth that seemed almost dreamlike. Breathing slowed, shivers stilled, and the night became softer, less hostile. The sound of many breaths rose together into a faint hum, a rhythm that lulled even the restless into sleep. In this way, the group itself became a furnace, its heat shared, never wasted, flowing like an invisible thread from one body to another. Children felt it most clearly. Nestled between their parents, they drifted into dreams cradled by warmth that seemed endless. For women, the closeness offered reassurance, their weariness eased by the steady presence of others pressing near. Hunters and men who bore the colder edges knew their role, to give more than they received, to let their own warmth feed inward. The balance was not spoken of, yet it was understood, carried out each night in silence. There was also comfort in the small details of this practice. The brush of a shoulder, the weight of a familiar arm, the steady rise and fall of a chest nearby. These simple touches reminded each person that they were not alone. In the vastness of the frozen forest, where wolves howled and storms raged, such closeness was more than physical. It was a shield against fear itself, a quiet assurance that survival was shared, never solitary. Sometimes, even the hides themselves carried warmth from the day, holding on to the faint heat of movement and sunlight. As these were layered over the group, the combined body heat grew stronger, trapped and recycled until the cold beyond the shelter seemed distant, almost forgotten. The night might last for hours without end, but within that circle of warmth time softened, passing like a slow, steady river. When dawn finally crept through the trees, pale and silver, the sleepers stirred together. Frost still clung to the walls of their shelter, and the air remained sharp, but those who rose from the embrace of the group carried with them a deeper heat. Their survival was proof of the unseen fire they had kindled within themselves and each other. It was a lesson repeated every winter, that warmth could be preserved not by flame, but by the steady nearness of life, woven together in silence beneath the weight of snow. The snowy forest was vast and unyielding, its silence broken only by the soft hiss of falling flakes and the groan of heavy branches bending under winter's weight. In such a world, warmth and safety were treasures not easily found, and yet the people of the forest knew secrets written into the land itself, one of the most surprising being the snow pits, shallow hollows carved into the frozen ground, where survival could be found in the very substance that threatened it. To the unknowing eye, snow seemed only an enemy, its touch cold, its weight smothering, its endless presence stripping away comfort. But for those who lived in its shadow, snow was also a shield. Beneath its surface lay stillness, a pocket where their biting wind could not reach, where the air was calmer, softer, and the body's warmth could linger longer. And so, with careful hands, tribe members dug down into the snow, scooping away its layers until a pit was shaped just wide enough for bodies to rest within. The work itself was quiet and deliberate. A hollow carved into the snow's heart did not need to be deep, just enough to sink below the level of the drifting winds. Branches and boughs were laid at the bottom, their rough surfaces turning the cold floor into a gentler bed. Hides were spread above them, thick and heavy, creating a barrier between flesh and frost. Once completed, the snow pit became less a hole in the earth and more a cradle, hidden away beneath the forest's icy blanket. When people descended into these shelters, the change was immediate. The wind, once sharp and relentless, softened to a whisper, blocked by the walls of snow. Sound itself seemed to shift, becoming muffled, as though the world above were distant and unreal. The cold remained, but without the gusts and biting air it was gentler, more bearable. Wrapped in hides, with bodies pressed together, the sleepers began to generate their own warmth, and the pit, sealed by snow, held it in like a vessel. Children found comfort in these strange shelters, their small voices echoing softly against the snow walls before fading into stillness. Women drew their blankets tighter, while hunters and elders shifted into protective positions along the edges, keeping the core warm. Breath rose into the confined space, creating faint clouds that brushed the walls, leaving behind a thin frost that glittered in the dimness like stars scattered across white stone. Within such a place the night felt both endless and strangely timeless, as though the forest itself had paused in its fury to grant a moment of rest. There was a rhythm to life in snow pits. At times people would cover the opening with branches and more snow, sealing the chamber almost completely, leaving only a small vent for air. This made the shelter even warmer, its stillness deeper, its silence more profound. Outside, wolves might prowl, winds might howl, storms might bury the land in darkness, but within the hollow there was calm, fragile, but real. To wake in the snow pit at dawn was to experience something almost dreamlike. The first light seeped faintly through the opening, painting the walls in shades of pale blue and silver. The world above was still harsh, the air still sharp, but those who rose from their hidden shelter did so with the strength of having endured. Snow, once thought only as a force of suffering, had become an ally, a blanket that, when shaped with wisdom, gave rest instead of ruin. The forest in winter was never truly silent. Even when the stars glimmered cold and distant above the canopy, the night breathed with the restless voice of the wind. It threaded itself through the trees, rattling frozen branches, sweeping across the snow with a hiss, and cutting into skin with a sharpness more piercing than ice itself. For those who sought to rest, the wind was an invisible enemy, stealing warmth no matter how thick the hides or how close the bodies lay. And so, the people learned to shape their own defences, not from wood or stone, but from the very snow that covered their world. Building snow walls was an act of patience and quiet strength. With bare hands or simple tools, drifts were pulled together, packed tightly until they formed ridges and barriers. These walls were not meant to be grand or tall, but sturdy, angled against the path of the blowing air. Each handful of snow pressed into place added to a shield that could transform a hostile clearing into a pocket of safety. In their simple whiteness, the walls blended into the forest's silence, appearing almost as though nature itself had grown them overnight. The difference they made was immediate. Behind a wall of snow, the bite of the wind softened, replaced by stillness. Flames could not be lit, but hides no longer whipped against the air, and breathing became easier, no longer stolen by icy gusts. Children could rest without shivering so violently, and mothers could draw their coverings tighter without fear of the wind tearing warmth away. Even hunters, lying on the outer edges, felt the relief, their bodies less exposed to the relentless sweep of cold. The act of shaping these barriers carried with it a kind of rhythm, almost ritualistic. Snow was scooped, pressed, and stacked, each block firming the wall into place. Sometimes branches or bark were wedged into the snow for strength, binding it together. At other times, the tribe built the walls in a crescent, curving around the shelter like protective arms. When several walls rose together, the space within felt enclosed, calmer, like a hidden chamber carved out of winter itself. Inside, the sound of the wind changed. What once roared and whistled became a muted hum, a distant whisper beyond the wall. The snow seemed to swallow noise, softening the night until the only sounds were the slow breaths of the sleepers, the creak of hides shifting, the faint sigh of a child settling deeper into warmth. In this muffled stillness, rest came more easily, and dreams unfolded like gentle snowflakes, unhurried, fragile, and fleeting. For the elders, the building of snow walls was a reminder of resilience. They had seen many winters, many storms, and they knew that survival often came not from fighting nature, but from shaping it to serve. The snow, though cold and merciless, could also become a protector if handled with patience. In its silence, it could guard against the very wind that gave winter its sharpest edge. By morning, when the storm passed and the first light returned, the walls often stood tall, draped with new snow that had fallen in the night. They looked like part of the forest itself, sculpted by unseen hands, their curves softened, their presence quiet. For those who rose within their shelter, there was gratitude, not only for the warmth preserved, but for the knowledge that even in the harshest season, safety could be built from the simplest of things. To build snow walls was to understand winter not as an enemy, but as a teacher. The same snow that buried paths and froze rivers could also block the wind, creating calm in the storm. And within that calm, people found rest, their bodies protected, their spirits renewed, their survival carried gently into another day. The snow in the forest was not only cold, but also mercilessly damp. To lie directly upon it was to surrender one's warmth in moments. For the frost beneath a body did not simply chill, it drew heat away like a thief, leaving skin stiff, hides soaked, and sleep impossible. And so the people, wise in the ways of their land, learned that the ground itself must first be tamed. Before resting, they laid down a barrier of furs or dry grass, turning the unforgiving snow into a bed that could cradle rather than consume. This task was simple in appearance, yet vital in practice. Bundles of grass gathered from the warmer months were stored for this very purpose, kept dry beneath bark or in the hollows of trees. When the time came, these stalks were spread thickly upon the snow, creating a springy mat that lifted the body away from the ice below. Where grass was scarce, thick animal furs were used instead, heavy and warm, their fibres resisting the pull of dampness. Together, grass and fir formed a shield, not against the air above, but against the earth's frozen touch beneath. The difference could be felt immediately. Without this layer, the cold crept in relentlessly, stiffening limbs and numbing breath. With it, the body rested easier, the warmth generated by hides and closeness preserved rather than drained. Children sank into the softness of the grass, its faint rustle like the echo of summer fields, while elders found relief in the thick pelts of deer or bison, their bones cushioned against the hardness of ice. For mothers, it was a quiet assurance that the ground would not steal the warmth from their children's sleep. The sound of settling upon such a bed carried its own comfort. Grass whispered as bodies shifted, blending with the soft crackle of snow outside. Firs muffled movement, their thick fibres embracing every contour. Together they created not only warmth, but also a sense of separation, a reminder that though the world beyond was frozen, within the shelter, life remained gentler, softened by care and preparation. There was also meaning in the choice of materials. Grass, though dry and brittle in winter, carried with it the memory of sunlight, of meadows swaying under warm skies. Its scent, faint but still present, filled the shelter with a sweetness that contrasted with the sharp bite of frost. Firs, on the other hand, spoke of the hunt, of skill and sacrifice, of the bond between people and the animals that sustained them. To rest upon these coverings was to lie within the circle of nature itself, guarded by gifts of both plant and beast. For those who had endured many winters, the laying of firs or grass became almost ritual. It was done without question, as naturally as breathing, for they knew that survival was never only about food or shelter, but about the smallest acts repeated faithfully. A single layer of grass, a spread of fir, these were the details that allowed the tribe to endure long nights when the forest seemed intent on swallowing warmth whole. At dawn, when the sleepers rose, they often found the grass compressed, flattened by the night's weight, or the firs crusted lightly with frost at the edges, and yet, these humble barriers had done their work. They had kept life close, preserving heat where none should have lasted, allowing the people to greet another day with strength in their limbs and steadiness in their breath. In this way, laying firs or grass over snow was more than comfort. It was wisdom passed quietly from one generation to the next, a reminder that the harshest ground could be softened, that even the coldest night could be endured if one first placed a barrier between flesh and frost. It was a lesson whispered by the earth itself, that survival lay not in resisting nature, but in shaping it gently into an ally. The snowy forest could be both beautiful and merciless. By day, sunlight glimmered across the frozen ground, turning the world into a silver dream. But by night, the cold deepened, and the winds sharpened their teeth, searching for every gap through which to steal warmth. Against such forces, people learned to work with what the forest offered most freely, its branches. Thick, sturdy limbs, fallen or cut from trees, became more than fuel for tools or structures. They became barriers, walls woven by human hands to shield life against the endless winter. The work began before rest. Men and women gathered branches from pines, oaks, or spruces, their arms heavy with the weight. These were laid down in layers, angled into a low wall or leaned carefully against one another to form a crude screen. Sometimes they were stacked in circles around a sleeping pit, their interlocked strength holding against the winds. At other times, branches were driven into the snow upright, their tips bending to meet and cross, creating a lattice like a woven fence. Though simple in shape, these barriers transformed the night. Behind them, the air grew calmer. The biting gusts that once tore through hides and furs were muted, reduced to whispers and sighs. The branches caught drifting snow as well, building natural insulation that thickened with time. With each storm, the barrier grew stronger, sealing off the group more completely, until within their circle lay a pocket of stillness. The sound inside such a shelter was distinct. Instead of the sharp whistle of wind cutting through the trees, the people heard only muffled rustling, the gentle scrape of branches against one another, and the steady rhythm of their own breathing. The children slept more deeply, the women held their coverings tighter, and the hunters at the edges found comfort in the knowledge that the forest itself had lent its strength. There was poetry in the act of using branches this way. Each tree, tall and rooted, had given a piece of itself, fallen limbs from storms, cuttings shaped with care, or dead wood long abandoned. Now those branches stood again, not as part of the canopy but as guardians of the night. They formed a circle of protection, echoing the way the tribe itself gathered close, shoulder to shoulder, to share warmth. Both circle and barrier worked together, one of bodies, the other of wood, bound by purpose and survival. The barriers also carried a memory of seasons past. In the rustle of pine needles, faint though brittle, there lingered the whisper of summer winds. In the scent of bark, rough and resinous, there remained a trace of green forests alive with birdsong. To lie behind such walls was to dream of warmer times, to feel the forest not as an enemy but as a companion, standing tall even in the harshest of nights. At dawn, when the first light crept across the snow, the barriers often stood half buried, the storm's work woven into their form. Icicles hung from their edges, glinting like fragile jewels while drifts pressed against their sides, strengthening their shape. Those who woke within felt the proof of their labour in the warmth still held within their shelter. The branches, silent and unyielding, had kept the wind at bay, allowing life to rest undisturbed through the long frozen hours. In this way, thick branches were more than wood. They were shields drawn from the forest itself, reminders that survival often required no more than patience, effort, and the will to see the ordinary transformed into protection. With them, the people endured, finding in the strength of trees a mirror of their own resilience. In the heart of the snowy forest, survival often depended on transforming what the land freely gave into quiet shields against the cold. Among the most valuable gifts were the sheets of bark peeled from tall trees, birch, cedar, or pine. Bark that, when lifted and set upright, could become a wall strong enough to turn aside the bite of winter's breath. To those who knew the forest well, bark was more than just the skin of a tree. It was a barrier, a second shelter, a patient guardian standing watch through the long, frozen night. The gathering of bark was an art in itself. Strips were taken carefully, never so much that the tree would be harmed beyond healing. Wide sheets were prized, their surfaces rough, ridged, or sometimes smooth with papery layers. When carried back to the sleeping ground, they were pressed into the snow, upright and firm, like tall slabs of wood waiting to form a circle. Piece by piece the walls rose, rough edges overlapping, gaps sealed by smaller fragments or packed with snow until little air could pass through. Once finished, the change within was remarkable. The wind, once sharp and relentless, broke against the bark and fell away. Inside the circle the air grew calmer, less frantic, the silence deeper. Hides and furs no longer whipped with every gust. Instead they lay still, holding their warmth. Mothers could rest more easily, children could settle into dreams, and hunters at the edges could release some of their vigilance, knowing that the bark itself now bore part of the night's burden. The sound of the world shifted as well. Outside the storm hissed and groaned, the trees rattled, and snow swept across the ground in endless waves. But behind the bark walls these noises dulled, softened into a distant hum. It was as if the forest had drawn a curtain, muffling its own fury so that those within could rest. The faint creak of bark, pressed and flexing against the wind, became a lullaby of sorts, a reminder of nature's strength, steady and enduring. There was also comfort in the bark's presence. Its smell, resinous and earthy, clung to the air, grounding the sleepers in the memory of trees that stood tall, even as snow buried their roots. Touching its rough surface in the dim light, one could almost imagine the tree it had come from, a giant still standing, somewhere beyond the shelter, weathering the storm as the people now did below. In this way, the bark was more than protection. It was a piece of the forest itself, drawn close to stand as guardian through the night. Children often pressed curious hands to the walls before sleep, tracing the grooves and ridges, whispering small stories to themselves of the trees that had given such gifts. Elders too felt a quiet reverence, remembering times when they had slept as children behind bark walls just the same. The cycle repeated endlessly, each generation trusting the forest, learning its ways, and passing on the knowledge that survival was always a matter of listening, observing, and using what the land freely offered. By morning, the bark walls bore the marks of the night's struggle. Snow clung to their bases, ice gleamed faintly across their surfaces, and sometimes frost traced delicate patterns along their grain. Yet they still stood, firm and unyielding, proof of their worth. Those who rose within the circle stretched their stiff limbs and breathed deeply, grateful for the silent protection that had held back the worst of the storm. To stand bark upright as protective walls was to see the forest as more than a place of danger. It was to recognise that even in its harshest season it gave generously, wood for strength, bark for shelter, snow for insulation. The people had only to shape it, to lean into its patience, and in return, the forest helped them endure. In the snowy forests where nights stretched long and storms rose without warning, even the smallest decision could mean the difference between suffering and survival. Among the most vital choices was how to place a shelter, not simply where it stood, but how it faced the endless wind. For those who had lived among the trees for countless generations, the wind was more than weather. It was a presence, a force that carried both danger and wisdom. To align a shelter against its path was to listen to that voice, to respect its power, and to turn it into something bearable. The wind was studied carefully, not with tools or instruments, but with the senses sharpened by years of close observation. Hunters watched the way smoke leaned from a small fire before it was quickly smothered by snow. Women noted how tree branches bent in one direction, how drifts piled higher on a certain side of a clearing. Children, too, learned to feel the way icy air cut more sharply on one cheek than the other, turning their faces into compasses. By such signs, the people understood the hidden paths the wind carved through the forest. Once the direction was known, shelters were shaped to meet it wisely. Openings were never left facing the oncoming gusts, for the wind would push snow inside, scatterbedding, and steal warmth with every breath. Instead, the door or narrow gap was placed where the air flowed weakest, behind the thick trunks of trees or along the lee side of a hill. The shelter's walls, made of branches, bark or hides, were turned broadside against the strongest current, offering resistance like a shield. This way, the storm's energy broke harmlessly against the structure rather than flooding into it. Within such careful placement, warmth could be preserved. A space that might have been bitterly cold became almost calm, the air inside steady enough for breathing without pain, for resting without shivers. Blankets of fur lay heavy and still, instead of whipping in restless motion. Children tucked close to their mothers no longer stirred awake at every gust. The quiet achieved by this simple act of alignment was a gift beyond measure, as important as food or water in the depths of winter. There was also a deeper meaning to this practice. Aligning a shelter with the wind was more than skill. It was respect. The people never believed they conquered nature. Instead, they sought harmony with it, finding the ways in which its rhythms could be softened, its edges blunted. To ignore the wind, to place a shelter carelessly, was not only dangerous but careless of the wisdom handed down by elders. Stories told in hushed voices reminded the young of nights when camps had been buried, when families had nearly frozen, all because the shelter had faced the storm rather than turned aside. The sounds inside a well-aligned shelter told their own tale. Outside, the wind shrieked, rattled branches and sent snow hissing in waves across the ground. Inside, these sounds dimmed to a low hum, like a river far away, constant but no longer frightening. Sleep could come then, steady and deep, carrying with it dreams of safer seasons, of summer hunts and warm meadows. Even warriors rested easier, knowing the walls were not simply built but wisely placed. By dawn, when the storm eased and pale light touched the treetops, the proof of wisdom showed itself. Snowdrifts piled harmlessly on one side of the shelter, while the interior remained dry, warm enough to rise with strength instead of weakness. Those who stepped out into the clearing breathed sharp air into their lungs, grateful for the foresight that had spared them needless suffering. To align a shelter against the wind was, in the end, a quiet lesson. Survival did not always come from strength, but from listening. It was not about resisting the storm with force, but about moving in harmony with its unseen paths, letting the forest itself teach how to endure. And in this calm balance, night after night, the people found both rest and resilience beneath the snow-laden sky. In the stillness of a snowy forest night, survival often began not with grand structures, but with the simplest of gestures, hands pressing into the earth, carving a shallow pit where warmth could linger. To those who knew the land, the frozen ground was not merely cold and unyielding. It was also a silent partner, holding secrets of shelter if treated with care. By digging shallow pits, native peoples created resting places that shielded them from wind, steadied their bodies against the storm, and offered a quiet embrace that the open air could never provide. The act itself was humble yet deliberate. Branches or tools of bone sometimes cleared the surface, scraping away the first crust of snow to reach the darker, firmer soil beneath. With patience, a hollow began to form, never too deep lest it trap dampness, but just enough for a body to settle slightly below the level of the ground. This small difference changed everything. The pit became a cradle, breaking the direct path of the wind, holding still the air that would otherwise sweep away warmth. Over the hollow, layers were added. Grass, moss, or evergreen boughs lined the floor, creating a cushion that separated flesh from frozen earth. Furs and hides were then spread, soft against the body, thick enough to trap heat. Above, sometimes a screen of branches or bark was laid, not to close the pit entirely, but to dim the open sky, to shield the sleeper from drifting flakes and the full weight of winter's breath. Inside, the pit became a pocket of quiet, warmer than the world outside, gentler than the storm that raged beyond its rim. The feeling of lying in such a space was unlike any other. The earth pressed cool but steady beneath, while the sides of the pit wrapped close, narrowing the world to a small circle of comfort. Sounds from the forest softened, muffled by snow and depth. Even the howl of wolves or the sigh of the wind seemed distant, as though the pit itself absorbed noise along with cold. For children especially, the shallow hollows felt like nests, secure, hidden, safe. These pits were rarely made alone. Families dug them side by side, close enough that warmth could be shared, voices carried easily from one to another. At night, the camp resembled a pattern of small hollows, each lined with fur, each holding a body wrapped against the cold. From above, it might have looked as if the earth itself had opened to cradle its people, each hollow glowing faintly with the quiet fire of breath and life. Beyond their practical use, shallow pits carried meaning. They reminded the people that survival often lay in humility, lowering oneself, seeking protection not above but below, close to the heart of the earth. Elders spoke of how the land remembered those who respected it, how by lying within the earth's shallow embrace, one was both protected and reminded of the bond between human and soil. It was a relationship of trust. The people carved hollows into the land, and the land in. Return offered safety, stillness, and a place to dream through the long night. By morning, when the first light touched the tops of snow-laden trees, the pits revealed their worth. The sleepers stirred, stretching from hollows that were dry, warmer than the open air, and sheltered from the sharp edge of the wind. Rising from them was like waking from a cocoon, the body strengthened rather than weakened by the night. With renewed energy, the journey could continue, the next camp prepared, the next shallow pit dug when darkness returned. To dig a shallow pit was, in the end, an act of quiet wisdom, simple, unassuming, yet powerful in its effect. It was a way of listening to the land, of using what already existed rather than forcing what did not. In those hollows, pressed close to the earth, people found not only warmth, but a reminder that survival often comes not from grand defences, but from small, thoughtful gestures in harmony with the world around them. Once the shallow hollows had been dug into the snowy ground, they were not left bare. Bare earth, though safer than open air, still carried a deep chill that crept slowly into the bones. To soften this cold, to transform a hollow into a place of true rest, the people of the forest turned to the simplest of materials, the dry grass that clung stubbornly beneath the snow, and the fallen leaves that whispered across the forest floor. These were not luxuries, but quiet gifts of the land, gathered with care and layered into the pits until they became cushions of warmth and comfort. The search for such materials began with patience. Beneath snowbanks, hunters and gatherers brushed aside white drifts to reveal patches of withered grass, still strong enough to serve. From hollows near tree roots, handfuls of old leaves were pulled, crisp, dry, their edges curled but still able to trap air. These small collections grew into bundles, carried back to the waiting pits. Children sometimes joined in, scattering piles of leaves like play, yet knowing their laughter carried purpose. Every handful gathered meant another layer of warmth for the night. The process of filling the pits was slow and deliberate. First, a thin layer of grass was spread across the bottom, weaving together into a soft mat. On top of this came leaves, their curled edges catching air pockets that insulated like the fur of an animal. Then more grass, then more leaves, each layer building upon the last until the hollow no longer looked like earth, but like a nest. The smell of crushed leaves rose into the air, earthy, sharp, a reminder of autumn long gone, yet now lending its memory to the heart of winter. To lie down in such a pit was to feel an unexpected gentleness. The body sank slightly into the bedding, cradled by the spring of grass, cushioned by the layers of leaves. Cold no longer bit from below. Instead, warmth lingered, held close by the air trapped within the bedding. Hides and furs spread above added to the cocoon, but it was the grass and leaves that made the base, the foundation upon which sleep could come. Without them, the pit was only a hollow. With them, it became a shelter. The sound, too, was softened by their presence. Each movement against the bedding gave a faint rustle, like whispers of the forest itself, as though the trees had gathered to sing a quiet lullaby. Children sometimes drifted into dreams, imagining that they were sleeping in a great nest, like birds hidden among branches, safe and unseen. Elders, closing their eyes, recalled summers when the same leaves had shaded them, now serving again in another season, reminding all that nothing in nature was ever wasted. This practice carried wisdom beyond its immediate comfort. Grass and leaves were not permanent. They decayed, they withered, they had to be renewed. But this was understood not as weakness, but as part of the rhythm of survival. Each night's gathering tied the people more closely to their surroundings, teaching them to notice what the forest offered, even in its quietest, coldest hours. It was a lesson in resourcefulness, in finding abundance where others might see only emptiness. By dawn, when sleepers rose from their hollows, the bedding bore the marks of rest. Flattened grass, crumbled leaves, pressed deep by the weight of bodies. Yet even so, it had done its work. The warmth it gave had carried families through the freezing night, steady and quiet, as vital as food or fire. New leaves and grass would be gathered for the next halt, the next shelter, the next story of endurance in the heart of winter's grip. Filling pits with grass and leaves was, in its essence, an act of turning hardship into comfort. It was a reminder that survival rarely demanded strength alone. It demanded attentiveness, the ability to see that even the smallest fragments of nature, the blade of grass, the fallen leaf, could carry the weight of life itself. In those quiet hollows cushioned by the forest's offerings, the people found not only warmth, but a deep sense of belonging, as if the earth itself had gathered them into its arms to rest. Once the hollow in the earth had been lined with grass and leaves, and the bedding laid soft against the frozen ground, there remained one final step to make the shelter complete, closing it from above. In the snowy forests, warmth was not only about what lay beneath the body, but also about what pressed gently overhead, sealing in heat and shielding against the restless sky. For this, branches and snow became the final guardians of the night. The people gathered sturdy evergreen branches, heavy with needles that clung even in winter's grip. These were not chosen carelessly. The thickest, most resilient were set aside to form the framework, while lighter twigs filled the gaps. When spread across the top of the pit, they overlapped like a woven roof, their dark green needles creating a dense mat that blocked drifting flakes and slowed the rush of air. Each branch bent, slightly under its own weight, forming a gentle arch that softened the hollow into something nest-like and enclosed. But it was snow itself that finished the work. With quiet hands, people scooped the surrounding drifts and spread them across the roof of branches. The snow clung naturally, packing tight into the spaces between twigs, piling into a layer that, paradoxically, insulated rather than froze. To one who did not know its secrets, snow was only an enemy, a biting cold to flee from. But to those who had studied its nature, snow was a shield, a silent blanket that trapped warmth beneath while keeping the storm at bay above. Inside such a shelter, the change was almost magical. The wind still roared through the forest, shaking tree limbs and sending icy spray across the open ground. But within the pit it grew hushed, muffled by the heavy roof of branches and snow. Breath misted in the air, rising only a little before vanishing into stillness. The body's heat, instead of fleeing upward into the night, lingered, circling back, warming the hollow like a hidden fire. Children curled into furs beneath this covering slept deeply, their dreams unbroken by the restless voices of the storm. The sight of the roof from below carried its own comfort. A dim lattice of needles and branches stretched overhead, touched here and there with faint crystals of frost that glimmered when the moonlight seeped through. Between the twigs, flakes sometimes fell softly, brushing against cheeks or noses before melting away. Gentle reminders of the world outside, harmless now that the shelter held firm. The weight of snow above pressed faintly downward, steady, like a hand resting lightly to reassure that all was safe. The elders often reminded the young that this practice echoed the ways of animals, who tunneled into snowbanks and burrowed beneath branches for warmth. The people watched and learned, honouring the creatures of the forest as teachers of survival. Just as the hare or fox curled in hidden dens, so too did humans find protection by letting the earth and sky cover them. In this quiet mimicry they became part of the forest's rhythm, sharing in its hidden wisdom. By morning, when light broke pale and cold, the covering still stood. Snow glistened white over the roof, branches sagged but held, and inside the hollows were dry and warmer than the open ground. Families stirred, stretching against their bedding, rising with less weariness than the night before. The coverings were carefully lifted aside, allowing pale sunlight to spill in, and then replaced if another night was to be spent in the same place. To cover a pit with branches and snow was not only to build shelter, but to create harmony with the elements. The very things that seemed harsh, the weight of snow, the barrenness of branches, were reshaped into allies, protectors through the long frozen hours. In that quiet darkness beneath a snowy roof, sleep came not in fear but in trust, carried gently through the storm until the world brightened once more. When the snow lay deep and the wind sang through the trees like restless spirits, survival in the forest often depended on the smallest acts of preparation. Among these, few were as important as the simple spreading of dry grass. To the eye, it was nothing more than withered stalks, brittle and pale against the whiteness of winter. Yet to those who understood its quiet power, dry grass was a shield, a cushion, and a blanket woven not by human hands, but by the earth itself. The gathering began before nightfall. Men, women, and even children brushed aside the snow to uncover patches of yellowed grass that had endured the cold beneath. Each handful was gathered with patience, bundled together, and carried back to camp. The sound of the stalks brushing against one another was sharp and papery, a reminder of autumn fields long gone. In the still air of a frozen evening, the smell rose faintly, dry, earthy, almost sweet, a scent that carried memories of warmer days and promised a little comfort in the night ahead. When brought to the hollow or the shelter, the grass was spread in thick layers across the ground. The stalks tangled together, catching air between them, creating a soft barrier that the frost could not so easily pass through. It was this trapped air that made the grass valuable. The earth's cold could not travel so quickly, and the warmth of bodies lingered longer. The thicker the bedding, the greater its gift, until even the frozen ground seemed softened and tamed. To lie upon it was to feel a transformation. Where once the earth had bitten into the bones, now there was a springy cushion, gentle and forgiving. The body no longer pressed against the frozen soil, but sank into a bed that whispered of fields and meadows. Movements gave off a faint rustle, like whispers of the past summer carried into the present night. For children, this sound was soothing, a lullaby woven into the bedding itself. For the weary, it was reassurance that the land still offered kindness, even in its hardest season. But dry grass was not only for the ground. It could be tucked into hides and clothing, stuffed between layers to create makeshift insulation. Hunters returning from long journeys often filled their moccasins with grass, keeping feet dry and warm even as snow soaked the world around them. In this way, grass became both a bed and a garment, a partner to the furs and hides that clothed the people. Its uses multiplied, proving again that nothing in the forest was truly small or insignificant. In the quiet of night, the thick layers of grass did more than keep bodies warm. They carried a sense of belonging, a reminder that the earth itself had prepared a place of rest. The bedding felt alive with memory. Each stalk once stood tall in sunlit fields, once swayed with the rhythm of summer breezes. Now, pressed beneath sleepers, they offered their final gift, comfort in the cold, warmth in the dark. By dawn the grass was flattened, pressed smooth by the weight of slumbering bodies, yet its work had been done. The sleepers awoke not stiff with frost, but eased by warmth, their energy preserved for the day's journey. New layers could be gathered if needed, the forest offering its endless supply in exchange for respect and care. To spread thick layers of dry grass was more than a matter of survival. It was a lesson in humility and gratitude. It showed that even the smallest, most fragile pieces of the world could carry immense strength when used with wisdom. And in the silence of a winter night, with snow piled high and stars hidden behind clouds, the rustling bed of grass reminded its sleepers that life endured, quietly and patiently, waiting for spring to return. In the deep silence of snowy forests, where the night pressed heavy and cold, even the ground itself seemed an enemy, hard, frozen, unyielding. Yet within this same land, another gift could be found, waiting quietly where tree roots spread wide and damp places lay hidden. Moss. Soft, spongy and alive with the memory of green seasons, moss became a secret mattress, turning the harsh earth into a gentler resting place for those who walk the winter paths. The gathering of moss was almost ritual. Families searched the bases of trees, lifting aside snow to reveal patches of emerald and faded gold, still lush beneath the frost. The touch of moss was always surprising, cool yet soft, yielding beneath the fingers in a way no stone or soil could. Bundles were lifted carefully, shaken free of ice, and carried back to camp in armfuls, the scent of damp earth and forest rising with each step. It was the smell of shaded groves and summer rains, carried into the heart of winter's grip. Once brought to the hollow or shelter, the moss was spread in thick layers, pressed gently into place until it formed a soft bed. Unlike dry grass, which rustled and shifted, moss was steady, dense and springy. It held warmth by holding moisture, and though it cooled at first touch, it soon adjusted, cradling the body with a steady gentleness. To lie upon moss was to feel almost as if one had been lowered into a green meadow hidden beneath the snow, a secret place of comfort amid the storm. Children often delighted in the texture, pressing small hands into its cushion and laughing at the way it sprang back. Elders too cherished its familiarity, remembering long hunts when a bed of moss had been the difference between aching bones and true rest. Moss became not only a mattress but a bridge of memory, connecting the hard present of winter to the softer seasons that lived in the heart. The quietness of a moss bed was also its gift. Where grass rustled and leaves crumbled, moss held silence. Movement stirred no sound, allowing sleep to come more easily, undisturbed by the restless noises of the forest. In that silence, breath seemed louder, heartbeat steadier, as if the moss itself listened and held its sleepers gently, guarding them until morning light. There were lessons, too, in this practice. Moss grew slowly, patiently, covering stones and fallen logs year by year. To use it with respect meant to take only what was needed, never stripping an entire patch, leaving enough behind for life to continue. This care reflected a truth the people lived by, that survival was not only about taking from the earth, but about moving in rhythm with its cycles, honouring what was given and protecting what remained. Through long nights, the moss mattress did more than ease the body. It softened the spirit, bringing a sense of peace that few other materials could match. The scent, the feel, the muted silence. It all worked together to remind those lying upon it that the forest, though cold and fierce, was also kind. And when morning came, with frost glistening on branches and pale sunlight filtering weakly through the snow-laden canopy, those who rose from moss beds did so with less weariness, carrying within them a quiet gratitude. To use moss as a mattress was not simply to make a bed. It was to weave a bond with the living forest, to rest upon its patience and endurance. In its softness, people found the strength to endure their hardest nights. In its silence, they found the stillness to dream. And in its green memory, hidden beneath winter's white, they found the promise that life, no matter how harsh the season, always continued. In the frozen silence of winter forests where snow pressed heavy upon every branch and the air turned to frost with each breath, warmth alone was not enough for survival. Beneath the shelters and pits, another danger waited quietly, moisture rising from the earth itself. Dampness crept upward, unseen, stealing heat from the body more swiftly than wind or snow. To guard against it, the people turned to one of the simplest, most abundant gifts of the forest: fallen leaves. By lining the ground with layers of leaves, they built a barrier between themselves and the cold earth, turning a damp hollow into a place of rest. The task began before nightfall, when daylight still lingered faintly between the trees. Children and elders alike joined in gathering leaves, brushing aside snow to uncover the curled remnants of autumn. Oak, maple, and birch leaves, dry and crackling, were most prized, for they held their shape and trapped air well. Bundles were carried back in armfuls, their edges crumbling but still strong enough to serve. The smell of the leaves rose sharp and earthy, a whisper of past seasons when the forest had been golden and alive, now lending its memory to the heart of winter's struggle. When laid across the floor of a pit or shelter, the leaves formed more than a cushion, they became a shield. Spread thickly, they trapped air between their layers, slowing the passage of cold from earth to body. Just as important, they absorbed the dampness that seeped upward, holding it within themselves so that furs and hides above remained dry. Without such lining, moisture would cling to bedding, chilling sleepers until even the thickest fur could not preserve warmth. With it, the body lay upon a dry foundation, comforted by the forest's most humble protection. The sound of the leaves was part of their presence. As they shifted beneath weight, they rustled softly, a faint music like whispers in the night. Some found the sound soothing, as though the forest itself was speaking gently, promising safety until morning. Children often pressed their hands into the piles before lying down, laughing at the way the crisp edges crumbled, turning their play into a part of the night's preparation. Elders, too, recognized the rustle as a companion, a reminder that even in winter's silence life still had a voice. The experience of lying upon a bed lined with leaves was one of contrast. The earth below was harsh, damp, and unyielding, yet above the leaf barrier there was softness and dryness. Heat from the body lingered instead of being stolen, and dreams came more easily when the cold no longer crept upward in silence. Even hunters, hardened by long journeys, admitted the difference. A night without leaves brought stiff limbs and aching bones, while a night with them allowed rest deep enough to rise with strength at dawn. This practice carried wisdom far beyond its practicality. It reflected an understanding of balance, of how even what seemed dead and discarded still held purpose. The leaves, once bright with autumn colour, did not lose their value when they fell. In winter they became blankets of the earth, protection for roots, and now protection for people. The cycle was seamless, each stage of life holding meaning, each fragment of the forest serving until the end. By morning the leaves were often crushed flat, their crispness gone, their edges softened by weight and moisture. Yet even so they had fulfilled their duty. The bedding above was dry, the sleepers were spared the bone-deep chill of damp earth, and the camp rose with energy instead of fatigue. New leaves could always be gathered, fresh layers spread, the forest offering its gifts again and again to those who walked with respect. To line the ground with leaves was, in truth, to weave the memory of autumn into the depths of winter. It was to understand that survival often came not from grand designs, but from small, thoughtful acts of harmony with the land. And in that rustling bed, warmed and protected against the creeping damp, the people rested with the quiet knowledge that even in the hardest season, the forest had not abandoned them. In the snowy silence of the winter forests, survival often depended on the smallest decisions, choices that balanced comfort against the unforgiving cold. One such wisdom was the practice of layering clothing, thin garments close to the skin, with thick hides and furs worn above. It may seem simple, almost obvious to modern eyes, but for the people of those ancient woods, this method was born of careful observation, trial, and the steady rhythm of tradition. They had learned that warmth was not only about what covered the body, but how layers worked together, trapping heat without suffocating the skin. The first layer was always thin, woven from fibres when available, or made from softened animal sinew, bark fibre, or even finely treated hides. Its purpose was not to provide heavy insulation, but to rest gently against the body, drawing away moisture from sweat and keeping the skin from sticking to the heavier hides. This thin layer breathed, and because it breathed, the skin stayed dry. A crucial defence in the frozen night, when even a trace of dampness could turn deadly. Above this, the people draped the furs and hides, the outer shield against the bite of the forest winds. Deer hides, softened and thick, wrapped across shoulders. Wolf pelts, with their dense undercoats, stretched across backs, and bear skins, heavy and broad, served almost as cloaks. These outer layers captured warmth, holding the heat that the body itself produced, while the inner layers ensured that sweat and dampness did not cling. It was a partnership of layers, a small science carried forward through generations, taught not in words, but in practice. The act of dressing itself became a ritual as dusk approached. Hunters returning from the day's search slipped out of damp garments, replacing them with carefully dried layers kept near the shelter's warmth. Mothers helped children into their thin wraps first, smoothing them flat before laying heavier hides above. The sound of fur brushing against fur, of leather tightening at the waist with cords, filled the twilight as the camp readied for night. And though each person dressed for themselves, there was a sense of shared understanding, that survival was woven stitch by stitch, layer by layer. The feeling of these layers was as distinct as their purpose. The inner cloth, soft and pliant, gave comfort to the skin, a second surface that seemed to calm the body's restlessness. The furs above were weighty and enveloping, pressing close like an embrace, their texture a blend of coarseness and warmth. Children often nestled into the scent of the hides, earthy and wild, the smell of the animals that once roamed the same forests. To them, the garments were more than protection. They were a reminder that the world outside, though cold and dangerous, also offered its gifts. By layering clothing this way, the people could move more freely too. A single, thick hide against bare skin would stiffen and chafe, but with a thin, underlayer, movement came easier. Hunters could bend their knees, lift their arms, and crouch silently without the distraction of discomfort. In a land where agility meant life or death, clothing was not only warmth, it was freedom. There was wisdom also in knowing when to add and when to remove. During moments of heavy work, cutting branches, dragging hides, or shaping snow pits, too many layers caused sweat, and sweat in winter was a quiet enemy. So garments were adjusted, thin layers allowed to breathe, heavier cloaks set aside until rest returned. The people lived by rhythm, listening to their bodies, letting instinct guide the balance between heat and cold. And in the stillness of night, when they lay close beneath shelters of bark and snow, these layers became part of the larger design of survival. Thin cloths absorbed the damp, thick hides captured the warmth, and together they made a cocoon against the icy winds that pressed against the walls. The forest might howl with snow and storm, but within their layered garments they felt the steady glow of life, safe for another night. Thus the lesson of thin layers beneath fur was never forgotten. It was a truth carried not in words, but in the steady hands of mothers preparing children, in the quiet choices of hunters dressing before dawn, in the way the tribe, year after year, faced the same deep winters with the same quiet resilience. In those layers, warmth became more than survival. It became tradition, memory, and the silent wisdom of a people who had learned to listen to the cold and answer it with care. In the deep heart of winter, when the snowy forest grew silent except for the groan of bending branches and the faint hiss of falling flakes, the people of the land learned to measure the cold with their very breath. Each night carried its own sharpness, some mild enough that a single fur across the shoulders could suffice, others so biting that even the strongest men shivered beneath the heaviest hides. And so, the art of survival became not only a matter of building shelters or laying furs, but also of knowing how to dress in layers, adding more when the air grew cruel, and easing off when the cold softened for a brief spell. Layering was never done carelessly. The body's warmth was like a small fire, fragile yet enduring, and clothing was the hearth that kept it alive. Too few layers, and the cold stole heat away. Too many, and the body sweated, leaving dampness that froze into danger. With this balance in mind, the people dressed as though weaving a shield, adjusting each fold and pelt with careful thought. It was a quiet skill, passed through generations, taught by observation rather than command. A child would watch their mother wrap hides over her shoulders, adjusting the weight until her body sighed with ease, and soon they too would know by instinct how many layers a night demanded. The first layer, always thin and close to the skin, was like the foundation of a home. It caught sweat. kept the skin from rubbing against harsher hides and allowed air to move just enough to keep dampness from clinging. Above it came the heavier furs, deer, elk, or bear, each chosen for its warmth and strength. On colder nights, another layer was added, sometimes two, until the body was enclosed in a cocoon of fibres, hides, and hair. These layers trapped not only warmth but also air, for air itself was the hidden guardian against the cold. The thicker the layers, the more pockets of air were held and the more heat the body kept. As the cold deepened through the night, adjustments were made with gentle care. A hunter, returning from a long watch, might slip an extra fur across his shoulders before lying down, while a mother might add another small hide over a sleeping child, tucking it close so no gap remained. The act of layering was not hurried but thoughtful, a rhythm of survival where every garment found its place like pieces of a living puzzle. The sound of furs being shifted, the soft thud of a pelt being laid across a body, was part of the night's quiet music. There was a wisdom in listening not only to the weather but to the body itself. If shivers came quickly, more layers were drawn close. If sweat began to rise beneath the arms, one layer was removed to keep the skin dry. In this way, the people lived in constant conversation with the cold, responding with patience rather than resistance. They did not fight the winter blindly, they adapted to its breath, shaping their clothing as the forest shaped itself under snow. The feeling of being wrapped in multiple layers was both heavy and comforting. The body sank into the weight, and though movement was slower, there was a sense of being embraced by the earth itself. The outer layers, rough and coarse, stood guard against the wind, while the inner ones, softer and smoother, cradled the skin in warmth. Children often whispered that they felt like they were sleeping inside a den, hidden from the storm, protected by invisible walls of fur and cloth. This practice also gave strength for the days ahead. A body well rested and well protected could rise with energy to hunt, to build, to travel through snow. A body poorly layered, either too hot or too cold, would wake weakened, its strength drained before the day had even begun. Thus, adding layers according to the cold was not only about comfort but about survival itself, a decision that determined whether a tribe would endure the long season or falter within it. And when the cold was at its cruelest, when the night stretched endlessly and the forest froze so deeply that even the stars seemed brittle, the tribe would lie together, each wrapped in many layers, forming a collective warmth. In those hours, beneath snow shelters and bark walls, it was not merely clothing that kept them alive, but the harmony of their choices, the thin inner cloth, the heavy hides above, the wisdom of knowing when to add one more. Survival was found not in grand gestures but in the quiet, careful layering of fur upon fur, until the body felt the promise of safety against the vast, unrelenting cold. In the stillness of winter nights, when the forest floor lay heavy beneath snow, and every breath turned instantly to frost, nothing was more dangerous than dampness. Cold itself could be endured with layers of fur and careful shelter, but when hides or garments became wet, soaked by melting snow, mist, or even the sweat of hard labour, the body's warmth drained away with frightening speed. The people of the snowy forest knew this truth intimately, and so they practiced the art of vigilance, never allowing wet clothing to linger, always replacing it quickly with dry layers before the chill could take hold. The danger was subtle but merciless. A hunter returning from hours in the woods might not notice at first how the snow clinging to his furs had melted against his body, or how sweat from long strides had seeped into the thin inner layers. Yet once the night winds rose, those damp patches turned icy, chilling the skin and sapping heat more cruelly than open air alone. Left unattended, the body would shiver, then stiffen, its strength fading silently. To ignore wet clothing was to invite frostbite, sickness, or worse. And so, in every shelter, bundles of carefully dried hides were kept near at hand, ready to be exchanged for garments that had lost their warmth. The act of replacing wet clothing became almost ritualistic. At the edge of the camp, snow was brushed off with swift, practiced hands, every flake shaken free before it could melt. Inside the shelter, furs were peeled away gently, steam sometimes rising from the dampness trapped within. Children were helped first, their small garments removed and replaced with soft, dry layers that smelled faintly of smoke from drying racks. Adults followed, their movements calm but deliberate, each piece set aside so it could later be dried and used again. The people knew that time was precious in such moments. The sooner the body was wrapped in dry warmth, the sooner its fire could recover. Drying itself was an ongoing task, woven into the rhythm of daily life. Freshly hunted hides were stretched and treated, then hung where smoke from low fires or the heat of bodies would draw out moisture. Even in shelters where fire could not be built, hides were spread across branches or laid against snow walls, allowing cold air itself to pull the dampness away. In this way, a cycle was maintained. Garments were worn, dampened, dried, and made ready again so that the tribe always had reserves of protection. The sensation of slipping into dry layers after wet ones was deeply reassuring. The skin, once tight with chill, relaxed beneath the warmth of fresh hides. The fur's softness pressed close, blocking the sting of air and reviving the body's strength. Many described it as stepping out of winter's grasp and back into the embrace of life itself. Children often sighed in relief, curling into the warmth of their mother's arms once dry garments were secured. Even hunters, hardened by countless winters, admitted that this simple act could mean the difference between despair and rest. Quick replacement of clothing also carried a lesson in discipline. No one ignored dampness, no matter how small. A sleeve darkened by melted snow, a hide damp along the edges, such details were never dismissed. Elders reminded the young that survival lay not in grand feats of courage, but in attentiveness to these small, quiet dangers. In the forest, one mistake of neglect could ripple into tragedy. One swift change of garments could preserve life. And so, every night, as the snow pressed close and the shelters grew heavy with silence, the people carried this habit like second nature. Wet hides were stripped away, dry ones laid in their place, the tribe moving as though in gentle rhythm. Outside, the winter howled, its breath sharp and merciless, but inside there was a steady warmth, preserved by care and vigilance. This simple practice, born of necessity, held the same weight as building snow walls or sharing body heat. It was a thread in the larger fabric of survival, a reminder that life was safeguarded not by strength alone, but by awareness, patience, and the willingness to act quickly. In the snowy forests, where cold could strike like an unseen predator, the people answered with their quiet wisdom. When dampness came, change swiftly and let the body rest once more in the comfort of dry warmth. In the vast and frozen forests, where the night stretched endlessly and silence hung heavy between the trees, survival was not only about warmth, but about vigilance. Darkness was never empty. Wolves moved quietly through the snow, their paws soundless upon the frozen ground. The wind shifted without warning, tearing at shelters and carrying the sharp sting of ice. Even the fireless camps hidden beneath snow walls or bark shelters were not beyond danger. And so the people lived by a rhythm of shared duty. Some stayed awake while others slept, guarding against the cold and the unknown until dawn. This practice was as old as memory itself. From the youngest hunters to the oldest elders, everyone knew the importance of the watch. It was never left to chance that all would close their eyes at once. Instead, the tribe arranged themselves in turns, one or two remaining awake, listening to the night, while the rest surrendered to the safety of dreams. The watchers did not see their task as a burden, but as a thread in the weaving of survival, for without them the night would be blind and unguarded. The act of keeping watch was quiet but not empty. The watcher sat at the edge of the shelter or near the snow wall, wrapped in hides against the sting of air. Their eyes scanned the shifting shadows, following the flicker of moonlight on snow, the movements of branches swaying under weight. Every sound was noticed. The crack of ice in the distance, the low sigh of wind through the pines, the faint rustle that might be an animal's step. Yet it was not fear that guided them, but calm awareness, a presence that belonged as much to the forest as to themselves. Sometimes the watcher moved softly through the camp, adjusting a fallen hide, tucking in a restless child, or checking that no snow had drifted too heavily against the shelter. Their hands, though chilled, carried gentleness, ensuring the sleepers remained cocooned in warmth. The tribe trusted these unseen moments of care, resting deeply because they knew another's eyes remained open, steady in the dark. For the watchers, the experience was strangely intimate. Alone in the silence, they felt the pulse of the forest more deeply. The breath of sleeping companions rose and fell in gentle rhythm, blending with the whisper of the wind. Stars glittered coldly above, their light sharp and eternal, while the earth below seemed vast and patient. Many spoke of these hours as a time of reflection, when the mind wandered beyond fear into quiet thoughts of ancestors, of hunts long past, of the endless cycle of seasons. Taking turns also preserved strength. If all had tried to remain awake, fatigue would have drained the tribe's energy, leaving them weakened by day. But with shifts carefully chosen, each person carried only a small portion of the burden, and all could rise at dawn with the energy to travel, hunt, or gather. The rotation itself became a symbol of unity, a reminder that survival was never the work of one alone, but the gift of many hands and many waking eyes. The children learned this practice as they grew. At first they were too young to take shifts, but as seasons passed, they began sitting beside their parents in the quiet hours, listening, learning how to hear the forest without fear. By the time they were old enough to take their place in the watch, they understood that it was not merely duty, but an inheritance, a way of honouring those who had kept watch before them. Thus the night was divided, not by hours, but by trust. Some slept, their bodies cradled in warmth and dreams, while others stayed awake, their senses sharp against the cold. Together they formed a living circle of protection, weaving safety through the long and perilous hours. When dawn finally broke, it was never claimed by one alone, but by all, those who had rested and those who had guarded, each sharing equally in the triumph of survival. In the snowy forests, danger did not come from the cold alone. The people knew that beneath the silence of the night, sharp eyes and hungering bellies moved unseen. Wolves padded soundlessly through the drifts, their bodies lean, their breath rising in clouds as they searched for weakness. Bears, though often deep in sleep, sometimes stirred in hunger and wandered close. And beyond the animals there was always the shadow of other tribes, strangers whose intentions could not be trusted. Survival in such a world meant more than warmth. It meant vigilance, and a constant awareness that protection was as necessary as shelter or food. The people never surrendered wholly to rest. Just as some stayed awake while others slept, those wakeful hours carried a purpose far deeper than watching the wind. They were guardians, alert for the gleam of eyes at the edge of firelight, or the soft crunch of snow where no companion walked. The watchers carried spears or bows, their weapons resting lightly in hand, not to provoke violence but to ensure readiness. They did not seek battle with animals or with men, but they did not allow themselves to be surprised either. Animals were often the first threat. Wolves tested the edges of camp, noses lifting to the scent of hides and stored meat. Their howls echoed through the forest, sometimes distant, sometimes hauntingly near. The watchers listened carefully, learning to measure distance and intent from the tone of each call. A deep chorus often meant a pack gathering strength, while a single cry suggested only one wandering hunter. If wolves came too close, the watchers would raise their voices, sharp shouts, clapping of hands, the striking of sticks, to remind the predators that this camp was not easy prey. And though hunger made animals bold, most turned away, unwilling to face the tribe's unity. Yet there were nights when the threat came not on 4 legs but 2. Other tribes, wandering as hunters themselves, might stumble upon the shelter. Sometimes peace was found, words exchanged in the cold air, and paths divided without harm. But not always. In times of hardship, when food was scarce, suspicion ran deeper than snowdrifts, and strangers were often treated as enemies before they could prove otherwise. The watchers knew this too, and so they observed every shape in the distance, every movement beyond the trees, ready to call out and rouse the camp if danger pressed near. Defences were never only about weapons. The very way the camp was arranged carried meaning. Snow walls were not built only to keep out the wind, but also to obscure sight lines, to make it harder for animals or strangers to see where people slept. Entrances were kept narrow so only 1 or 2 could pass through at once. Sleeping places were arranged with women and children in the centre, men on the edges, so that in any sudden moment the most vulnerable were shielded by bodies and strength. Even in slumber the tribe lay in quiet formation, prepared for what the night might bring. The sound of protection was subtle yet constant. A spear tip scraping softly against stone, a bowstring drawn and loosened again, the low murmur of voices as one watcher passed the duty to another. These were the sounds that threaded through the night, barely louder than the whisper of the forest, but heavy with meaning. They reminded every sleeper that their rest was guarded, that even in a world of predators and strangers, they were not alone. For those on watch, the burden was not only physical but spiritual. To guard was to hold the weight of many lives in silence, to know that a moment of inattention could ripple into tragedy. Yet it was also a place of honour. To be trusted with the night was to be woven into the tribe's strength, to stand as a shield while others dreamed. And when morning finally broke, when the snow glowed gold beneath the rising sun, the watchers felt the quiet pride of knowing they had kept danger at bay, unseen but not unprepared. In this way, protection became more than a response to threat. It became part of the people's very way of life. They lived with the knowledge that the forest was both provider and predator, both sanctuary and snare, and so they endured, not by denying the dangers around them, but by facing them with patience, readiness, and unity. Wrapped in hides, resting close, and guarded by the steady eyes of their watchers, the tribe found peace even in a world where danger never truly slept. Through the long winters of the snowy forests, survival was not only about finding warmth but about keeping balance. Balance between rest and vigilance, between safety and strength. The people knew that a single pair of eyes could not stay sharp through the endless night, for fatigue dulled the senses and made even the most skilled hunter vulnerable, and so they followed a rhythm as old as memory itself. Guard duty was rotated every few hours, passing silently from one watchful soul to the next, ensuring that no moment of darkness was left unguarded, and no body was left exhausted. The system unfolded with the steady patience of ritual. As dusk settled, the first watchers prepared themselves, wrapping hides tightly around their shoulders, gripping spears or bows, and taking their places at the edges of the camp. Behind them, the others lay down, trusting their lives to those who remained awake. Time was not counted by numbers, but by feeling. The slow arc of stars above, the weight of silence stretching until it pressed heavy on the eyes. When the watchers felt their focus begin to waver, they would rouse the next pair with gentle touches, whispers soft enough not to disturb the children. Thus the duty moved like a circle, one shift flowing quietly into another, unbroken until dawn. The rhythm was kind, for it spared no one and favoured none. Every able adult took their turn, whether hunter, gatherer or elder, strong enough to stand against the cold. In this way the burden was shared evenly, and no one grew weak from sleeplessness. Even the young, once they reached an age of understanding, were given smaller watches, short stretches of time where they learned to sit with stillness and listen to the whispers of the forest. In this way, guard duty was not only survival, but also teaching, a passage from youth into responsibility. For those on watch, the hours were filled with silence, but never emptiness. The crack of distant ice, the shuffle of snow dislodged from branches, the occasional call of an owl, all became signals to be weighed, measured, and understood. The watcher's ears grew sharp, learning to distinguish between the harmless sigh of wind and the subtle tread of paws on frozen ground. Their eyes too adjusted, able to catch the faintest movement in the silver light of the moon. It was a time when the senses stretched outward, reaching further than they could in daylight, drawn taut by the quiet responsibility of the night. The act of rotating shifts gave more than safety. It gave rest. Those who slept did so deeply, knowing their slumber was guarded. They could dream without fear, their warmth unbroken by sudden alarms because others had accepted the weight of vigilance in their stead. Then, when their own turn came, they rose with renewed strength, ready to carry the watch for their companions. This cycle of rest and duty wove the tribe together, each member holding part of the night, each life sustained by the others. The feeling of being woken for a shift was familiar. A hand on the shoulder, a whisper of one's name, the faint rustle of hides pulled aside. Such small gestures carried immense meaning. To rise into the cold, leaving the warmth of layered furs, required quiet discipline. Yet it was done without complaint, for each person knew that another had already borne the weight of the night, and now it was their turn to return the gift. This shared rhythm became a silent oath, an understanding that survival was a circle of trust, unbroken so long as each fulfilled their part. By morning, when pale light crept across the snow, The tribe was weary but strong. None were crushed by sleeplessness, none left vulnerable by neglect. The forest might have howled with wolves, the winds might have battered the snow walls, yet the people endured, guided by the steady rhythm of their rotating watch. In this practice lay a deeper truth, that survival was not a matter of lone strength, but of unity, patience, and shared duty. And so, through every winter, they continued the cycle. Every few hours the guard shifted like the stars passing across the sky. The cold forest never grew less dangerous, but within their shelters the tribe carried a certainty that so long as they moved together in rhythm, no night, however long or perilous, could break them. The winters were not gentle. They pressed upon the people with an endless weight, cutting through bone and breath, surrounding every step with frost and silence. Yet within the harshness of the season lay something deeper than danger. It was a trial, a measure of spirit, a test that each member of the tribe learned to face. To them the cold was more than an enemy. It was a force that shaped resilience, a silent teacher that demanded endurance, and rewarded only those who refused to bow beneath its sting. When the first sharp winds came, whispering through bare branches, the people prepared not just their shelters, but also their minds, for they believed that winter revealed the truth of one's strength. A person could not hide from the frost. Weakness, hesitation, or fear showed itself quickly in the frozen dark. Those who could withstand the icy air, who could keep moving when every muscle stiffened, who could breathe steadily while snowflakes stung their skin, these were seen as strong, worthy, and dependable. Children were taught early to meet the cold with quiet determination, standing still in the wind, learning to master the shiver that tried to claim them. It was a rite of passage as much as survival. The tribe's story spoke of ancestors who endured storms greater than any the living could imagine, walking through nights so cold that even fire froze and breath turned to crystals in the air. These tales were not told simply to frighten, but to inspire. If those before had survived such endless winters, then surely their descendants could endure as well. Around the fires, elders reminded the young that every season of cold was an opportunity to prove courage, to strengthen the body, and to bind themselves closer to the spirit of the land. For the earth itself, in its frost and stillness, seemed to whisper, "Only the strong may remain." To face the cold was to accept discomfort as a companion. When hands grew numb, they were not merely suffering, they were learning patience. When feet ached with frost, they were not failing, they were gathering strength. The tribe did not complain of the chill, but met it with a quiet pride, as though each breath of frozen air carved endurance into their lungs. Even hunger, sharpened by the absence of game, was seen as part of the trial. To go without, to resist despair, to share food sparingly but without bitterness. These too were signs of true strength, revealed only when the cold tested every boundary of human need. In moments of hardship, the people often repeated a simple truth to one another. The cold does not come to kill, but to measure. This saying guided them through nights when firewood ran low, when shelters cracked under snow, when the howling wind seemed endless. It reminded them that survival was not only about tools or walls, but about the will to endure. And in this endurance, they discovered something unshakable, confidence that if they could survive winter's grip, they could survive anything. Even among the hunters and warriors, the cold became a quiet mark of honor. Those who could track deer through waist-deep snow, who could stand still for hours without faltering, were praised not just for skill, but for the strength of spirit they carried. The tribe admired not the loud boast, but the silent endurance. The one who simply endured the frost without complaint was often respected, more than the one who spoke of their bravery. Strength, in this way, was measured not in words but in the calm acceptance of hardship. When spring finally returned, melting the edges of snow and loosening the rivers, the people carried with them a memory of winter's trial. They remembered the nights when their breath froze before them, when hunger gnawed, when firelight flickered low, yet still they had stood together and endured. The cold had tested them, pressed upon them, and in surviving they had proven themselves once again. Thus, each winter was not only a season of danger, but of becoming stronger, wiser, and more certain of their place in the unyielding rhythm of the world. For to the tribe, the cold was not only a force to be resisted, but a mirror that revealed their strength and in that reflection they found the quiet pride of survival. When the nights grew long and the snow pressed deep into the forest floor, courage was not always found in strength alone. The people knew that even the bravest hunter, even the most skilled elder, could feel the weight of fear in such silence. The cold carried more than frost. It carried uncertainty, and in that vast uncertainty the heart sometimes wavered. To steady the spirit they turned to rituals and prayers, quiet acts that connected them to forces beyond themselves, to ancestors unseen, and to the eternal rhythm of earth and sky. Rituals were woven into the very fabric of their nights. Before lying down in the snow shelters, a soft hum of song often rose, low and steady, filling the dark like a heartbeat. The words were old, passed from mouth to mouth across generations, and though their meaning shifted with time, their rhythm carried the same purpose, to remind the people that they were not alone. Each note was a thread binding them together, pulling courage from the shared breath of many voices. The melody drifted through the shelter, mingling with the sound of the wind, so that even the storm seemed to pause and listen. Prayers were spoken in whispers, sometimes as chants, sometimes as soft words breathed into cupped hands before sleep. They were not always requests for safety, but acknowledgments of strength already given. A hunter might whisper to the spirit of the deer, thanking it for the hide that warmed his shoulders. A mother might murmur to the moon, asking it to watch over her children as they slept. An elder, awake during the watch, might speak to the ancestors, calling upon their endurance as a guide. These prayers, simple yet sincere, filled the night with a sense of unseen company, as though the forest itself stood guard. The rituals often included small gestures, repeated faithfully. Hands pressed to the earth before sleep, to feel the cold soil and remember the land beneath. A piece of dried grass placed near the entrance of the shelter, symbolizing growth that would one day return. The act of circling the shelter with a handful of snow brushed gently against its walls was thought to keep the winds from breaking through. None of these rituals were done in haste. Each was slow, deliberate, carried out with the calm rhythm of belief. In their patience, the people found peace. Children were taught these practices as much as they were taught to build huts or to wear hides. The youngest learned to hum softly, to repeat a prayer after their mother's voice, to press their hand gently upon a piece of bark or stone before resting. Through these small actions, they learned that courage was not about denying fear, but about giving it shape, speaking it into the night and watching it fade with the words. For once a prayer had been spoken, fear no longer sat silently in the heart. It had been carried away into the vast forest. At times of great storms, when the winds roared and shelters shook, the rituals became even more important. The tribe might gather close together, their voices rising in a chant that echoed like a drumbeat, steady against the chaos outside. The rhythm united them, giving shape to their courage, and though the storm raged on, the people felt a deep calm, as though they were anchored by invisible hands. In such moments they understood that courage was not a spark that appeared suddenly, but a flame kept alive by repetition, by faith, by the slow and steady weaving of ritual. Through these prayers and acts, the people did not imagine themselves escaping hardship. They knew the cold would still bite, hunger would still ache, and danger would still walk beyond their walls. Yet within their hearts, the rituals turned fear into steadiness, weakness into patience, and loneliness into belonging. Courage was not something they searched for, it was something they built, night after night, prayer after prayer. And when dawn arrived, pale light spreading across the snow, they rose not only with bodies that had survived the cold, but with spirits that had endured. The rituals had carried them through the darkest hours, reminding them that even in the fiercest winter, courage could be summoned with a song, a whisper, a prayer spoken into the silence. The people did not see the forest as an enemy, nor the snow as a curse. To them, nature was not something to conquer, but something to walk alongside, a vast and living presence that shaped their lives as surely as the breath in their chests. The cold, the storms, the silence of winter, these were not punishments, but reminders of balance, of the way all things carried both gift and hardship. To live well was not to fight against the forest, but to learn its language, to move with its rhythms, and to accept its challenges as part of life's endless circle. In the snowy forest, this harmony was visible in every choice. Shelters were built not to defy the land, but to blend with it. Walls of snow shaped by hand, bark stripped carefully from trees without killing them, branches gathered with respect. Even in hunger, the people remembered to give thanks for every root, every animal, every drop of water drawn from frozen streams. By honouring what they took, they maintained a balance that allowed the forest to continue offering its gifts. To take too much, to waste, or to destroy recklessly would have meant breaking trust with the land itself, and in such betrayal, they believed survival would eventually be lost. The harmony also lived within their patience. Winter demanded stillness. It slowed the rivers, silenced the insects, and pressed the world into quiet. Instead of resenting this stillness, the people mirrored it, learning to wait, to move only when needed, to listen before acting. They knew the animals too had slowed, the bear curled in its den, the deer moving cautiously through drifts. By moving with the same care, the tribe became part of the winter's rhythm rather than strangers in it. The forest did not resist them, for they had become one more voice in its quiet song. Children were taught to see the cold not as cruelty but as balance. The snow feeds the rivers, the elders would say, tracing patterns in the frost. The rivers feed the earth feeds us. In this way, the hardships of winter were not separated from its gifts. They were threads of the same fabric. A storm might strip branches bare, but it also cleared the weak, making way for new life when the sun returned. Ice might seal the streams, but when it melted, it carried fresh water to the soil. By teaching these truths, the tribe ensured that fear never replaced respect. Even in danger, when wolves prowled too near, or winds threatened to collapse a shelter, the people remembered that these forces were part of the world's balance. Wolves took the weak deer, keeping the herd strong. Winds cleared the forests of broken limbs. To be in harmony with nature meant to recognize its purpose, even when it pressed harshly upon human lives. The people did not waste energy in hatred, but used wisdom to protect themselves, moving when necessary, building stronger walls, and learning from every storm. In their calm acceptance, they found strength deeper than resistance. At night, as the tribe lay close in their shelters, the sound of the forest seeped in, the creak of ice, the groan of trees under snow, the distant cry of an owl. These sounds were not frightening but familiar, reminders that they were never alone. To live in harmony was to hear the voice of the land in every sound, to feel its presence in every gust of wind. Even the silence of deep night carried meaning, a quiet that wrapped around them like a vast, unseen blanket. When spring returned, melting the heavy snows and releasing the rivers, the people did not speak of having survived nature, as though they had been at war with it. Instead, they spoke of having walked through winter with the land as companion. They had faced hunger, cold, and danger, yes, but they had done so with respect, patience, and gratitude. The challenges had not broken them, for they had not resisted the forest's will. They had lived with it, moved with it, and because of this harmony, they endured. Thus their survival was never just physical, it was spiritual, woven into the great cycle of earth and sky. To live in harmony with nature's challenges was to live in truth, accepting that every gift carried hardship and every hardship carried wisdom. And in that quiet balance, they found not only survival, but belonging, a sense that they were part of the forest, just as the forest was part of them. And so, dear dreamer, our quiet journey drifts to its gentle end. Tonight we walked softly through winter woods, following the echoes of resilience and wisdom in how did Native Americans sleep in snowy forests without fire. We saw how silence, patience, and harmony with the land carried them through nights that would seem impossible to us now. Thank you for being here, for resting your mind in these stories, and for letting history wrap around you like a warm blanket. Wherever you are now, may your night be just as still as theirs once was. If this story soothed you, you're always welcome to return, and perhaps to subscribe, only if it feels right, only if it feels gentle. These tales will always be here, waiting to keep you company when sleep feels far away. So close your eyes now. Imagine the snow settling softly on the trees, the hush of the forest holding every sound, the glow of a single ember fading into night. Let the world grow quiet. Let the story rest. And may your dreams carry you peacefully until morning. Good night, and sleep well.